New York ain't New York anymore. How I miss those old pals of mine.
Hello, history lovers, and happy Independence Day, America. I'm your host, Dean Carianis, and this is the History Author Show on iHeartRadio. I want to thank everybody who has been reading my columns in the New York Sun, everybody who stayed subscribed, even though I've gone a few months between this episode and the last one. Those of you listening to me on terrestrial radio, appreciate you as well when I comment there or guest host there, and for following me on Twitter at HistoryDean. But that's all housekeeping. You are here to dust off the old time machine. We did that for an old friend, Paul Kahan. He holds a Ph.D. from Temple University, and he is a commentator on U.S. political, economic, and diplomacy matters. He's here to talk about his latest book. It's called Philadelphia, A Narrative History. Now, with the 249th birthday of America on July 4th and the 250th looming next year, the nation's eyes are going to be casting back to the city where independence was born, and that is Philadelphia. This book is a comprehensive look at the people who built that city and the people who founded it, from the Lenape tribe to the 21st century residents who you can hear any given Sunday, and pains me to say as a Giants fan, deep into the playoffs lately, shouting, "Fly, Eagles, fly." You can find the previous interviews with Paul Kahan at historyauthor.com, linked right there on the page for this episode, and you can find him at paulkahan.com. That name is spelled Kahan. Okay, now that our time machine has reached the city of brotherly love, let's join Paul Kahan and discuss Philadelphia, A Narrative History. I'm joined now by Paul Kahan. He's the author of Philadelphia, A Narrative History. Paul, welcome back to the History Author Show.
Thanks, Dean. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Well, I feel at war with myself because as a Giants fan, as somebody who's seen various teams get beaten up by the Philadelphia Flyers over the years, I'm not supposed to like anything about Philadelphia. And here I am enjoying your book so much. So you managed to convince me to like something about Philadelphia other than McGillen's Old Ale House. And that's an
I'm so glad to hear that. I mean, that is high praise coming from a New Yorker.
You are a son, though, of Philadelphia, physically and emotionally. You're a guy with ties to it. So how do you go about translating that familiarity into a book that appeals to people who they're interested in the history of America's fifth largest city? Maybe they're not, and I'm looking for a read about it, especially with the 250th anniversary looming in 2025. How do you go about crafting that so you cast as wide a net as possible, and you do great selling books when you go out places like Barnes and Noble, do a personal event?
You know, that's a really great question. And I knew that I've known for many, many years I wanted to write this book. It's my seventh book, but I struggled early on for how to write this book. And I struggled more than with any of the other previous books. Biographies, histories of specific events, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. History of a city is a little bit different, but I knew that it was time to write this book because there hadn't been a comprehensive single volume history of the city written in more than 40 years. And that's my lifetime, right? Oh. And the previous book had appeared at a very dark time in the city's history. It kind of reflected that. Each of the chapters was written by a different historian, so it was very uneven in terms of focus. And I had spent my entire career in museums, historic sites, museums, working with artifacts. And I think that there are a lot of insights that you get about the history of a place when you spend your day talking about that place or talking about its objects to the public. And I think all of those things kind of came together and informed first my desire to write the book, but also how I approached it. Initially, I thought, well, maybe I would try to write a biography, think of a city as a living organism and, write it that way. And that didn't really work. And then I was like, well, what if I framed each of the chapters around a prominent Philadelphian, like Ben Franklin's Philadelphia, William Penn's Philadelphia? And it didn't come together. And one of the reasons this book took so long was trying to figure that out. But the most interesting thing is, as you know, I'm a professional historian, and I was struck by the number of times in writing this book, I came across something that I didn't know about Philadelphia. And I grew up outside the city. I've spent most of my life in and around Philadelphia. And there were so many things I learned about the city and its history that even as a professional historian, even as a nearly lifelong Philadelphia metro region resident, I had no idea about. And I think that excitement and enthusiasm more than anything else is what gives the book its accessibility and its readability. I'm sitting with you excited about the things that I'm learning. And I hope that as you're reading it, you're getting excited too.
Everybody can hear it in your voice, and that's so important. And I almost didn't mention your PhD in history from Temple University, where you might think, well, this is some book that's just for other academics. It's not really accessible to me. It's going to be a textbook. It's going to be a slog. And I want to stress to people that as they can hear in your voice, this is a book where you meet somebody there on the SEPTA, on the train, and you start telling them this is what used to be here. 278 pages before you get to the index and the appendices. That's not a real thick, dry book. You try to keep it exciting and appeal to everybody. It's a big topic. How do you go about taking that passion you just displayed? That was probably 400 words right there that you spoke, and narrow it down into a book that really is accessible for everyone.
So that's a really great question. And the short answer is you rely very heavily on your editor. And I had a really great editor at Penn who worked with me on this. And I remember when I first met him, I had emailed him and said, I'm thinking about doing this book. Is this something Penn would be interested in? He said, yeah, why don't we meet for coffee? And over a cup of coffee, I kind of laid out what I was thinking. And he said, I have been waiting 20 years for someone to throw something like this over my transom. But you just pitched me a 2-volume book. You get 1 volume, 150,000 words, and not 1 word more. And he held me to that. And I think that in many ways, that was really good because it really forced me to be very disciplined and be very ba-boom, 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 ba-boom in the writing and the research, always thinking, the reader on the other end and what's going to keep that story moving. That's incredibly important. And for any aspiring writer who's listening to this podcast, let me just say that your editor and you have the same goal. That editor has gone through this process many more times than you have. Listen to them because they are probably smarter than you in many ways. So my hat is off to my editor, but also worked with the general public for most of my career. And so I have a pretty good sense of interacting with people, what's going to spark their interest, what's going to get them excited, what's going to get them engaged. And it was those insights that I brought into the book. And what your listeners probably don't know, but I think we should mention is we're recording this on July 3rd. And of course, July 4th is hugely important in Philadelphia and across the United States. And the book proceeds from a counterintuitive assumption, which is Philadelphia does a miserable job remembering its history. If you want to remember the revolution, we've got you covered. But there's so much else that happens before the revolution and after the revolution that makes Philadelphia the distinctive, interesting, and let's be honest, angry place that it is. That revelation is a great starting point because we're all starting from the same level. I mean, so much of this stuff I had no idea about. And I had been doing this for 20 years at that point when I started writing this, which is kind of wild. And it's one of the reasons why it was so important to me to write this book.
I think we all have that tendency where we look at a city and we think of a certain period, or we look at a person even. We think of Winston Churchill. I think of him as a young man in the Gilded Age, usually when I think of him. But most people have this vision of him just as the older man in World War II. But he had this long life and he did many different things in the course of it. Philadelphia is this really long-lived city. And yet, because of things like the 76ers, because this was a huge moment, we tend to think of it fixed in that moment, that it's forever the summer of 1776. Philadelphia, I think of the yellow fever season often.
Oh my
the
goodness.
days when they would have yellow fever every year and people would have to flee the city. And unfortunately, there was a lot of dead. What is your period, place, or impression? What hits you now, having written Philadelphia narrative history? You say, this is really interesting too, and it made us what we are today.
That's a really great question. I'm kind of an early to mid 19th century guy. And, one of the shocking things that I really make a big point of in the book is even after the national capital leaves in 1800, and even after the Commonwealth capital leaves in 1799, Philadelphia is largely the cultural economic, social, to a lesser extent, political capital of the United States. It's like New York and Los Angeles today mashed together. This is the place that's, on the cutting edge of science. It's setting fashion. When Andrew Jackson, who's elected to the presidency in 1828, wants a new pair of glasses as president, he doesn't order them from New York. He doesn't get them from Washington. He doesn't order them from his home in Nashville. He gets them from Philadelphia because this is where the best opticians in the world were. This was at the cutting edge of penal reform. And, I spent many years working at Eastern State Penitentiary.
Another book.
All of these things, it was referred to as the Athens of America. I mean, this was the place to be for educated, smart, sophisticated people. And I think that Philadelphians have just memory hold that. We just have absolutely no sense of that portion of our history. In 1876, they do a centennial celebration for the Declaration of Independence, and it is a nationwide and in some ways worldwide celebration. Brings people from around the globe to Philadelphia. And it's not so much a celebration of the past as it is a focus on the future. I mean, they have engines the size of buildings generating electricity to power this, and they have delegations from all around the world showing off traditional folkways and doing this and doing that. And the president of the United States comes several times. So, the eye of the country was on Philadelphia at several key moments throughout the 19th century. And it's really only in the late 19th and early 20th century that it kind of becomes eclipsed by places like New York, Washington, eventually Los Angeles, those other kinds of places. And I think that moment that it's spent in the national spotlight is incredibly important. We are more than just Independence Hall. We are more than just the Liberty Bell. We've got this really rich history, and the marketing of that history plays an incredibly important role in the financial health of the city today. And the stories that we tell can be drivers of economic health. I mean, Eastern State Penitentiary literally gentrifies the Fairmount neighborhood. 20 years ago, Fairmount was not what it is today. And it's largely because of the success of that institution telling that story that the surrounding area has totally transformed. And I think that there are roadmaps for doing that throughout Philadelphia if we tell these stories. I mean, for instance, the gun that Booth used to shoot Lincoln, made in Philadelphia. I mean, that's an incredible story. And there's no sign or plaque or anything at the site where that happened. But it's there. It's a story worth telling.
Piece of James A. Garfield's spine as well with the bullet in it.
Yeah. At the Muter Museum.
Which in and of itself is an amazing museum. And you get so compelled. And I think of that museum, the Muter Museum, which that was one of my early interviews was about it. And I think of a friend I have from Australia, and he was just dying to go there. I don't know how he even heard about it in Australia, but that's how he identified with Philadelphia, was this amazing medical museum. He said, well, they have the world's largest colon, which was, okay. I mean, whatever gets you to Philadelphia, I guess.
Right.
Gosh, that's a great dig.
If that's what does it for you, right? We have the Independent Seaport Museum, which is an undiscovered gem on Penn's Landing, has the USS Olympia, which is the battleship that brought home the original unknown soldier from World War I. It's an incredibly well-preserved 19th century battleship. When do you get aboard a 19th century battleship? If you're a history nerd, you do it here in Philadelphia. All of these gems. But, it's not just the highs like that. It's also the lived experience of folks. One of the things that I said in the book was I very much wanted it to be a usable history. As Americans, we tend to take places for granted, right? We tend to just think of these places as they've always been there, they've always been like this. But Philadelphia's history, Philadelphia was a place that was planted and planned and cultivated. And its current form is the sum total of choices that have been made over the last 3.5 centuries. And if you want things to be different, you need to at least understand the choices that were made so that you can make different ones in the future. And so I very much hope that folks read it and see it, as what I describe as a usable history, as a way to understand how we got to where we were. And if we want to get somewhere different, this might be the starting point for thinking through how to get there.
Yeah, I like that you talk about the idea of where we're going in the future throughout the book, and also where it was in the past, because you talk about diversity in the book, and I think it's a word because it gets thrown around so much in the past year that people have lost a little bit of the meaning in it. It just sounds like, okay, it's a thing. Theodore Roosevelt talked about how people talked about reform as if it's a concrete substance like cake that you could just go cut and dole out as needed, and not really analyzing the meaning behind what kind of reform it might be. So you do that when you talk about the Lenape tribe. You say that that's the first people. But in this context, I wanted you to speak about it because I think people need to hear exactly what you mean, because this is not just we're talking about the physical. Tell us what you mean. What is that diversity? How does it start there when they found the city?
Sure. I think a lot of people think that Philadelphia kind of begins with William Penn's charter in 1681, and it doesn't. I mean, the Lenni Lenape had been there for thousands of years prior in the Delaware Valley, prior to the first Europeans who set foot here. And the first Europeans who quote unquote colonized the Delaware Valley were not English people. They were Dutch and Finns and Swedes. And they built a community where none of them had the power to impose their political or will on the other folks, and so they had to live in tacit harmony with one another. And the region was incredibly desirable because you have really good land. I mean, Pennsylvania is still an incredibly important farm state. At the same time, you're not, and for anyone who's spent a summer in Philadelphia, this is going to come as a shock, but actually it gets a whole lot worse if you go further south. I mean, the Chesapeake is an absolute malarial swamp. And so health is a whole lot better in Philadelphia. It's really the ideal mix of New England and Virginia. Fertile soil, but not swampy and marshy. And so you get this growth. And so by the time that Penn gets here in the 1680s, you've got half a century of natives and various Europeans and some enslaved Africans living in at least tacit harmony. And that creates muscle memory that Penn can sort of build on. Now, the story of Penn's founding of Philadelphia is kind of a twice told tale, religious liberty, Quakers, all that good stuff. And that's all important. But it makes Pennsylvania an incredibly attractive place for not only English dissenters, but also Germans who don't really fit in and Irish who don't really fit in for one reason or another. And so as a result, you get this flood of folks who are coming to this place for religious toleration, which Penn early on recognizes is a hell of a marketing gimmick, because he founds Pennsylvania not only as a refuge for Quakers, but also as a place where he can make some money. The idea is he's going to sell some land, he's going to lease some land, he'll have a constant revenue that's coming in, and that religious liberty, in addition to being a good value, is also a good marketing opportunity. And what happens is it turns out Pennsylvania's growth is explosive, the colony grows very quickly, and Penn lacks the infrastructure for making it pay. And ultimately, the colony swallows his fortune. He ends up, at one point, he's in debtor's prison. He ends up heavily in debt. And when he dies, he leaves the colony first to his wife, and then when she dies, to his sons. And none of them are ever able to make it pay. And in fact, even during the Revolution, they're still having a fight about what's owed to the Penn family and, all this kind of good stuff. But that diversity is baked into Pennsylvania and into Philadelphia from the very beginning, and becomes an almost defining characteristic throughout the 18th century in a way that many other cities don't really experience, at least that early.
I love this idea, and I'll never now look at 1776 the same way. And I don't think people who read Philadelphia narrative history will either, because you realize that just what you were saying before, people tend to assume, oh, it was always that way. It was always going to happen, because it did happen. But you needed to find a place where liberty and people could come together. You mentioned Andrew Jackson, and not shoot each other in the face over disagreements, but that there was a culture of people getting along, airing their grievances, and then going out and saying, okay, well, now we're going to move on. We're going to compartmentalize. And this starts from what you write in the book, from the very earliest days and it becomes something that allows liberty to take root where it wouldn't have maybe in another city, certainly in a city in the South, where if they'd put it down there at the time, where you had a sparser population, you didn't have as a cosmopolitan population. It really all has to be in Philadelphia. When you look back, it seems so natural, but it started way before then, didn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I also want to be clear. One of the other themes of the book is, of course, conflict. There is a lot of conflict, and it too shapes the evolution of Philadelphia. And probably the most important way in which it does that is, up until 1854, Philadelphia, the city, is about a 2-mile rectangle, which is what we think of today as Old City. It's basically Vine Street to South Street, bordered by the rivers. There are all these other communities that are in the county of Philadelphia. And the problem is there's no unified police force. There's a lot of conflict between Catholics and Protestants, between whites and black people. All these different things are going on. And these conflicts break out into a series of riots and uprisings in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s. And so in 1854, as a way to bring closure to that, the Commonwealth Legislature actually consolidates all those communities that are within the county of Philadelphia into the city of Philadelphia. And overnight, Philadelphia goes from being this 2-mile rectangle to this 154 square mile behemoth. And it's one of the few cities in the United States that is the size of a county. The other good example is, of course, Los Angeles. And it brings together a lot of people who didn't necessarily want to be brought together. And it makes a very unwieldy governing, an entity that's very unwieldy to govern even today. I mean, governing a county is very different from governing a city. And yet here in Philadelphia, that's how we do it. And that story, I think, is incredibly important. And it's an important testament to the role that space plays in the evolution of Philadelphia, which of course is another theme of the book.
You write in Philadelphia, a narrative history, that the consolidation wasn't the panacea its boosters hoped. That's a quote. That's how I prove I read the book. I'm not lying to everyone listening. If I'm going to recommend a book, I'm going to care enough for the listeners to read it. But in all seriousness, though, they push it just like they do in New York City. There's consolidation of all the boroughs together. They add the outer boroughs to the Bronx and Manhattan, and people tend to think that, oh, this will be great. That overnight Brooklyn's suddenly going to want to be New Yorkers. Well, they don't. They fight it tooth and nail. They're not all happy right away overnight, and maybe they don't buy into the spirit of Philadelphia that we were just talking about. So after that occurs, how do they swallow the way that sometimes you swallow something? Oh, it doesn't agree with me. How do they try to ensure that the greater Philadelphia area has that same identity, that it doesn't fall apart, that it doesn't cause more problems than consolidation solves?
See, that is also a really good question. I think that the prevalence of neighborhood identity in Philadelphia is still very, very strong. And we're coming up now, we're 175 years out from consolidation. But even today, when I talk to people about the book, they ask about, did you write about Fox Chase? Did you write about Fairmount? Did you write about Spring Garden, Moyamensing? The identification of those neighborhoods is still very, very important to people. Even if, they moved out of those neighborhoods 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, they're still very connected. So there is, I think, a strong geographic connection. And, for Catholics, it's, St. Hubert's Parish or, this parish or that parish. But there is still a very strong connection to place. At the same time, there is also a very strong Philly connection. One of the questions I get all the time from people when they ask about the book is, did you grow up in Philadelphia? And I'm always a little sheepish to say, well, I grew up in Montgomery County, right? Because for some people, that's not Philadelphia.
Yeah.
When I lived in California for a few years, that was the only time in my life that I've been able to describe myself as from Philadelphia, because we were 3,000 miles away. They had no idea. But here, I'm always very, very careful to say, no, I lived in Montgomery County. I now live in Delco. You have to be very, very careful about that. I think on one level, it over time, Some of those identities kind of wore down, particularly during the 20th century in the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s, when the influx of federal dollars through the New Deal gave Philadelphia, really for the first time in its history, effective municipal government. And that was incredibly important. Philadelphia, for most of its existence, has not had effective municipal government because, for a variety of reasons, having a lot to do with limitations put on it by the Commonwealth legislature, tax base, all that stuff. But really, there was this moment in the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s when the New Deal provides the kind of money that makes it possible to have really good services, really high quality municipal services. And in many ways, I think that becomes a moment where Philadelphia, as this 154 square mile behemoth, as an idea, works. And in the 70s, when the federal government cuts that tap off, you begin unwinding that. And I think you end up with some level of balkanization, not as much as existed in the 19th century, obviously, but money and municipal services play an incredibly important role. I like to say, in the 18th century, one of the ways that the city raised money was electing someone mayor and then fining them when they refused to serve. And I like to say that in my lifetime, people go to jail to be the mayor of Philadelphia. But in the 18th century, they went to jail to avoid being the mayor of Philadelphia. And I think there's some truth to that. People didn't want it because it was a lot of headaches. And we celebrate guys like Ben Franklin for their civic virtue and their volunteerism. But what we don't say is they had to do that. They had to rely on themselves. The city doesn't develop a public library system until the 1890s. You don't get a municipal fire department until the 19th century. You don't get a municipal police department until the 19th century. So all of those things were groups of folks kind of getting together and trying to figure it out, sometimes better than others. Necessity became the mother of a lot of that invention. And I think that's an important part of the story to tell. Yes, we should celebrate guys like Franklin, but we should also point out it would not have been necessary if there had been infrastructure in place. And for a variety of reasons that I go into in the book, it just wasn't there.
You mentioned a couple of times there the 19th century, and I wanted to mention the Gilded Age, which is the focus of your chapter 7. The title is Corrupt and Contented, 1876 to 1901. And that period fascinates me. So I want to ask you, take me back to Philadelphia in that period and explain to readers what they'll be hearing, because that's a period of time. It tends to get blurred, I think, in a lot of people's minds. It's a bunch of bearded presidents, not a lot's happening. Come on, let's hurry up and get to the exciting Theodore Roosevelt eventually. Let's get to the exciting 20th century. So talk about that Gilded Age period that you cover here.
Sure. So let me just step back and say, the Civil War is an incredibly important moment for Philadelphia in a variety of different ways. And I won't bore your listeners with that. They can read the book. I spent a lot of time talking about that. But one of the things
book's not boring.
The book is not boring. I won't unpack. I won't unpack the book. They can go and read that chapter.
That's what you say. I don't want to spoil it for people.
I don't want to spoil it. Thank you. But one of the most important things that happens is it fundamentally transforms the city's political environment. It becomes a Republican city. The Republicans, which is a party, is invented in 1854. No one's a Republican before that. After the war, the city is solidly Republican and will be until the New Deal. So for about 80 years, or about 70 years, it's going to be a Republican city. It's also, incredibly importantly, a central railroad hub, which makes it a center of industry. So you have this very pro-business political environment married to a lot of big businesses. The dominant one is the Pennsylvania Railroad, but there are others. And so Philadelphia becomes an incredibly important industrial city. There are a lot of industry-friendly rules and regulations that get put into place. So it's a place that's very exciting. There's a lot of innovation. There's a lot of technology. There's a lot of growth. But it's also a place that has the downsides of industry, right? There's a lot of coal burning, it's dirty, all those kinds of things. And because of the closeness of the Republican political machine to the railroads and other kinds of companies, you get a lot of corruption. And so this sort of becomes the dominant form of government. And Lincoln Steffens, who was the guy who gives Philadelphia the title Corrupt and Contented, was a muckraker who was a journalist. We would almost call them a tabloid journalist in the late 19th century. And he does an expose of municipal governments. He looks at city governments all around the United States and he says they're all corrupt and they're all contented, but Philadelphia is the most corrupt and the most contented. And that quickly becomes a model that they almost embrace. It's almost like, 4 or 5 years ago when Trump said, bad things happen in Philadelphia, and almost immediately people start selling T-shirts with that emblazoned on it. Like that just becomes the way that Philadelphia kind of thinks about itself. And, Philadelphia City Hall is a monument to that. Most folks don't know that when they walk into Philadelphia City Hall, they are walking into the nation's largest municipal office building, still the largest municipal office building. It was opened its doors in 1901. It's a beautiful Beaux-Arts building. It took so long to build. They started it in 1869. The Beaux-Arts actually went out of style while they were building this building. They spent millions upon millions of dollars on it. And of course, many of the contractors went to prison for cost overruns and kickbacks and corruption and all that stuff. So it's a 32-year process. They build it out, and it is beautiful. It is one of the most beautiful, it becomes a landmark immediately. But it is a monument to that corruption. And so it's a building that cuts both ways. But if you want to understand Philadelphia and you ever make it to the city, go walk around that building. See the statues of the people they put up around its perimeter and kind of understand, what are the values, what are the ideas that they were trying to promote with this construction of this building. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. Millions of Philadelphians walk through that building every year, no idea what that story is, but it totally moves the geography of the city west. It's in the center of what we think of as Center City. It moves that geography west, and largely that was so it could be closer to the headquarters of the PRR and other railroads. So there was this very close relationship between big business and politics, and that leads to that corrupt and contented title. And, not for nothing, Lincoln Steffens had an axe to grind. The reformers were not spotless and clean hands. And one of the things that people need to remember is when we talk about reform, reform cannot be imposed from the top down. It's got to come from the bottom up. And a lot of these 19th century reformers lived in mansions on Broad Street and had no idea what the lived experiences of the folks in the city were, and didn't really understand why folks would continue to vote for these political machine politicians, because they didn't understand the goods and the services that those folks were providing on the day-to-day. And one of the things that you see throughout the story of Philadelphia is these reform efforts that are generated by these wealthy individuals who don't ever spend any time asking your average Philadelphian, does this make sense? How could this be better? What matters to you? And that ends up really hobbling efforts at reform in the city.
It's still so much the case with a lot of people. And this goes back to that Theodore Roosevelt quote, talking about reform like it's a substance like cake that you could just dole out. I call myself a reformer. That's it. Well, are you getting anything actually done? Right. And I think that's something that people don't get in the history of any city. And as you said earlier, and as you write here in the book, it's so important to recognize why and what the conditions are and to be connected to them. So I want to remind everybody who they're listening to. This is Paul Kahan. He's the author of Philadelphia Narrative History. You can find him at paulkahan.com. That's Kahan. You can find our 3 previous interviews, which are just as much fun and energetic as this one, at the historyauthor.com page for this episode. And I really hope you all pick up the book, because you could tell Paul, if Paul doesn't sell out all of them, he's going to have to go down there to that city hall, go down there to the museums, and be waving that book in the air and telling people you don't know this great history. And I know I've had that temptation myself many times about a great historical story. But I'm gratified to see the book is getting a lot of praise. Inga Saffron, a critic at the Philadelphia Inquirer, writes, Philadelphia has been waiting a long time to have its story told in a single compact volume. And she uses that word accessible again, a sharp and accessible history. And I'm so happy about that. I love that. I feel this is my goal. Anybody can tune into this and hear it. And maybe who thinks history is dry or it's boring or they're stuck in traffic on the Pennsylvania or New Jersey Turnpike after this weekend coming home from the beach or their barbecues on July 4th, they can really connect through this, and they can hear about the conflict that you mentioned, hear about the Quakers, and get tempted to go and pick up a copy of the book, because so many things are overlooked here, and it's not just a place that you drive through. No city or town is a place you just drive through, but Philadelphia has so much that gets overlooked, I find. And I've been frank about my bias here. For instance, the Philadelphia Sound. I hadn't even heard that phrase since the 70s when I was a child. Let's jump into that. Let's do a little bit of audio, because it's something I think we just don't, because Philadelphians today embrace so much that tough guy attitude. Nobody likes us. Nobody likes us, as they chant at the Eagles game. Talk about the Philadelphia Sound and some of these other overlooked things. I'm just going to cut you loose.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is another thing that people have no idea about, how important Philadelphia was to the development of popular culture. Radio, television gets its start here in Philadelphia. And then Bandstand, which is a defining memory for the boomers. Like, this is how you knew what styles were in and what bands you should be listening to and all that stuff. That is produced in West Philadelphia. Every time I ride the train, I ride by the building where it was filmed. And like, that was where you were tuning in to get your fix. And it was setting the trends nationwide for what, admittedly, white kids of that generation were going to be into. And then, as a result, you have this infrastructure that gets created. The Philadelphia Sound in the mid to late 60s becomes a really defining moment first in black music and then in rock and roll. Some of the biggest hits of the 60s and the 70s are recorded here in Philadelphia, are written here in Philadelphia. Incredibly, incredibly important. And then beyond that, Philadelphia becomes almost a metaphor in a lot of ways. I mean, everyone's heard Elton John's Philadelphia Freedom, which becomes a metaphor. I mean, you can't swing a dead cat in Philadelphia without hearing that song, and it's a great song. But
about a tennis team, by the way, about a tennis team.
Yes,
right?
Yes. Or Bruce Springsteen's Streets of Philadelphia, which was an incredibly big hit, was tied to a movie called Philadelphia.
Yeah, they blew up the Chicken Man in Philly last night.
Yes,
all those great lines.
The Chicken Man. But my favorite thing is, and this gets us back to one of the reasons why I wrote the book. One of my formative memories as a kid, and this gives you a sense about how permissive my parents were, was watching the movie Witness, which came out in 1984. And for your listeners who are not quite familiar, Witness tells the story of an Amish mother and son who come to the city to sell agricultural produce. They ride the train in. And then they go to 30th Street Station and they're riding the train out. And Philadelphia just looks dirty and dingy. And like, you got to walk over junkies as you're, going to the bathroom. And the kid goes to the bathroom in 30th Street Station and hears a murder. This is all nonsense. No one's getting murdered in 30th Street Station, but this is the view people get. And they go down to the police department. They talk to a cop played by Harrison Ford. And so Officer Han Solo is like, well, what are you going to do? It's Philadelphia. People get murdered. What do you want me to do? But anyway, the murderers find out the kid heard the murder, and so they try to kill the kid. And in so doing, they end up shooting Harrison Ford. And so they flee in his car to Lancaster, which is 180 degrees different than Philadelphia. Like, I think they were filming the city under a blue filter, and then they get out to Lancaster and everything's bright and green and lovely. And of course, not only does Harrison Ford heal physically, he heals emotionally. His soul is opened up by reconnecting with the simple life. But of course, the murderers follow him out to Lancaster. And what we find out is actually, and I know I'm spoiling the ending of a 40-year-old movie here, the murderer is a black cop, right? You can't trust institutions in Philadelphia. You can't, you can't trust black people. Like, it's all racist and like all this stuff. That is the image that people have of Philadelphia. And in many, and it's not just that movie. There are a lot of movies that do that. So I talk a lot about that in the book, about how you have these pop culture references in the 70s and 80s that really inform the way that people think about the city. And it really it creates this narrative, this negative narrative. One of the reasons why Sylvester Stallone picks Philadelphia for his narrative is because he wanted a setting that was as beaten down and as broken as Rocky is supposed to be. And, look, New York goes through its own phase of poor movie depictions in the 70s and 80s. But I really think Philadelphia leads the pack in just the number and variety of negative depictions, even as a lot of the conditions it's depicting are changing, right? By the time Philadelphia comes out in 93, Philadelphia is actually changing for the better. But if you watch that movie, it's incredibly depressing. All the establishing shots are awful, and they're supposed to be awful. They're supposed to be bleak.
Yeah.
So, in many ways, it cuts both ways. Philadelphia is a center of pop cultural production from the 1920s forward, but much of that pop cultural production depicts the city in really negative ways. Unfairly, I would say.
Yeah. And I have to say, and I'm somebody I even do this with people that I know. I mean, unfortunately, I grew up as a big teaser, I guess. And I was usually the one getting bullied. So I guess people develop a sense of humor, right, over time because you could strike back that way sometimes with people. But I interviewed Irene Levy Baker. Her book was 100 Things to Know About Philadelphia Before You Die. And I remember I brought up the Eagles fans and the D-cell batteries and throwing snowballs at Santa. There's another guy who's an engineer for one of the radio shows that I guest hosted, and he's also the voice at the vet in the old days. And he said, yeah, I used to have to make the announcement that there's a jail on premises and that people will be arrested and you will be tried here. And he said it was a real great experience to be booed by 80,000 drunken Eagles fans. He said, and I would mention just casually, well, I would tease him. In fact, I went there and you got to get the engineer on your side if you're going to be in radio. So I got him a mug, an insulated coffee mug, and I put some D-cell batteries inside it. And I said, well, this way, if I'm doing something wrong when I'm hosting, you could whip the D-cells at me. And you ask everybody that, and then they all laugh. People in Philadelphia are of good cheer. But then you get the whole explanation, the defense of, well, that was just they had it coming, that Santa Claus, because people waited for hours. They were really tired. They were, it was one columnist that wrote it. They throw the snowballs, but it's not every Santa. That was 60 years ago. And it shows you that sense of pride. And as an outsider, it's made me understand that better than I would have otherwise. I love that your book shares that, tries to stimulate people to have some interest in it and not just go by it being a punchline, which it is, and a great punchline at that, but I'm fair.
Well, and one of the things and I think that's a great setup. One of the things that I really hope is that after people read the book, that they'll go and see some of these places. As I said to you earlier, few people know that the gun that Booth used to kill Lincoln was made here in the city, and we don't have a marker for it. But you can go see that. You can go see the home of the undertaker who managed Lincoln's funeral and then later Grant's funeral and played an incredibly important role in the city. You can see where Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain, lived when he was here in the city. These are the kinds of things that I think people are like, wow, I had no idea that kind of stuff exists. And because of that diversity, we've got incredible restaurants, we've got incredible cultural spots, we have a world-class art museum that is more than just the setting for Rocky, right? Like, we have an amazing art collection here in the city of Philadelphia. And we love the absurd and the wild. A couple of years ago, this guy in Philadelphia, the Chicken Man, and I Google the Chicken Man. He was eating rotisserie chickens. And the last one he did, he went to an abandoned pier. He put up signs all over the city. I will be eating my 40th rotisserie chicken at this pier at this time. It is not a party. And people showed up to cheer him on as he ate this 40th rotisserie chicken. They were wearing shirts that said, "This is not a party." It was amazing. And, that's the kind of stuff that I think gets lost in the shuffle when people tell stories about how angry and disaffected Philadelphians are. Yeah, that's true. But we're also a city that cares about those kinds of things and that supports people and that, has not one story, but many stories that can be told. And, if nothing else, I hope that the book whets people's appetites for those stories.
I wrote a New York Sun column. People can go find it. I'll link to it on this historyauthor.com page. But the headline was something like, "Where all the things that divide us melt away." And I mentioned meeting these young Eagles fans at a Giants game. One of the kids said, "They told us you were all a-holes." I'll use that old man term. "But you're really nice." I said, "They tell us the same thing about you Eagles fans." And the kid's face fell and he said, "Oh no, they're right. We are." He said, but, if you're nice to us, you show us some respect. You're not up in our face here. None of us want to be identified by our worst fan, the worst person in our city, by the worst moment in our city's history. And I like the idea that you, in Philadelphia Narrative History, you bring up some of these stories that are colorful, but don't play into the stereotype of the negative of the city. Here's another Chicken Man. That first Chicken Man that I mentioned that they blew up in Philly last night, the line, that's from Bruce Springsteen's Atlantic City. So here you're bringing in another Chicken Man. So this book can help change. And I think that's why it's having success with Philadelphians, where they're saying, look, there's so much more to our own city that maybe we didn't know that we could share with people that are good, positive stories. They may not always be as funny, but you know what? Some of them are. A guy eating 40 rotisserie chickens, good luck finding something funnier than that, right?
Yeah, it's a weird and wonderful place is about all I can say. And I will say, on the Philly sports fan, the only football game I've ever been to where there was a brawl and people got thrown out was in Oakland, and it was Oakland fans, not the Eagles fans. My wife went to the bathroom, came out, and 3 rows were gone. And she was like, what happened? I'm like, the Oakland fans got mouthy and the Oakland cops dragged him out. So there may be hope for Eagles fans yet. Or maybe everyone's descending to our level. I don't know.
Winning Super Bowls will help. Then you can feel a little better about the traveling. And I happen to be wearing a Raiders shirt, by the way. But this is, I'm not a Raiders fan, but my friend of mine, his uncle happens to be Fred Biletnikoff, and this is his from the Hall of Fame.
Very cool.
So there you go. A little Philadelphia, the Pennsylvania connection, not even just Philadelphia. This is all such great stuff. Check out things like James Buchanan. He comes out of his career out of Philadelphia. He proves unequal to the task of solving the Civil War, but he's a guy who knew about all those different factions, all the I don't even want to call them warring, because it's so unique the way that the Philadelphia politics work and the identity of the city. But I want to close with one question. It's from your dust jacket. Again, the book is Philadelphia, a Narrative History. And you say that understanding Philadelphia's past is key to envisioning future possibilities for the city of brotherly love. Send us off with your hopes for how your book, when it's in people's hands, helps guide people in the city and guides the city itself into America's 250th anniversary in 2025 and beyond that.
Wow, what a great send-off. I think the most important thing is that nothing is written in stone. History is the sum total of choices at various levels that have been made, and that nothing, therefore, is inevitable. Different choices would have yielded different outcomes. And so if you believe in things like democracy and equity and fairness and, the city of brotherly love, we can make different choices to get to different places. But it's very, very important to me that people don't, because I think if you accept things as just the way things are always going to be, it becomes very easy to lose faith and it becomes very easy to lose hope. And at that point, you just stop trying. And so what I want to remind people is nothing is the way it is because it was ordained by God or whatever. These were choices that were made, and we can make different choices and get different outcomes in the future. And I think that's incredibly important. That's why I think more than anything else, this book is a hopeful book in a way that, the books that were written about the city 40 years ago really weren't. It's not a story of decline. It's not a story of dead ends. It's a story of choices. And we as a city, as a community, as a group of individuals can make different choices.
Well, Paul Kahan, author of Philadelphia Narrative History, you have done just that. You've made people optimistic and positive here today. Everybody who's listening has a little spring in their step, I think. Thank you for bringing that energy to the story of the city of brotherly love and sharing it with everyone, sharing it in your book. I hope people will pick it up, learn about one of America's great cities, and one that's so easy to overlook when you're going down that New York City to Washington corridor. Those of us here on the East Coast, it is more than all the little anecdotes you pick up, more than just some trivia, more than D-cell batteries. Let me put it that way. D-cell's a funny word. but I sincerely wish you the best of luck with the book, and I look forward to our next conversation. This is a book you've made me into an evangelist for, and I really hope that you sell 1 million copies of it because it's great.
Thank you so much. I look forward to chatting with you again soon.
Again, the book is Philadelphia, a Narrative History. As always, you can find the Amazon link to purchase your copy at historyauthor.com, and we hope you will click through there. Amazon gives us a few shekels, a portion of every dollar you spend each time you buy a book through us, at no extra charge in your shopping cart. For just those few extra clicks, you can help keep the flux capacitor on our time machine humming like usual. Once again, my thanks to Paul Kahan for joining us and giving us a chance to know the city where America was born. Check out our archives for our chats about his previous books. Those are The Presidency of Ulysses S. Grant, Amiable Scoundrel, Simon Cameron, Lincoln's Scandalous Secretary of War, and The Bank War, Andrew Jackson, Nicholas Biddle, and The Fight for American Finance. And for that one, I have to say, if you buy only one book this year with a president strangling a Speaker of the House with his bathrobe belt, make it The Bank War. It really is an exciting story, and I know that you'll enjoy it. You'll enjoy our conversation, but absolutely pick up the books. I love that Paul is a guy who writes books for everybody. He's not just a guy writing them for other people that are in academics. That's fine, but it's nice to have history accessible to everybody. You can find Paul Kahan at paulkahan.com. That's Kahan. And remember, let me know what you think of the book and the interview on X at HistoryDean. That's it for this installment of the History Author Show. I hope you'll join us for our next all-new interview right here on iHeartRadio or wherever you're listening. It was great to be back with you this week. Thanks so much for time traveling with us today. And happy Independence Day, America.
We still call it Broadway, but what's in a name? Take it from Georgie, it isn't the same. On the east side, west side, things ain't like before. There are tears in the eyes of the regular guys. Oh, New York ain't New York anymore.